Man rescues trapped bear. What the bear does next will shock you. The biting chill of Montana's wilderness wrapped itself around Jack Harper as he trudged through the dense forest, his boots crunching through layers of crusted snow. At 75, Jack moved slower than he once did, his frame slightly stooped, but his hands were still steady, weathered from decades of woodworking and laboring under open skies. The solitude of the Absaroka Beartooth wilderness suited him. It had been his refuge since Margaret, his wife of 45 years, passed away 3 winters ago. Their cabin, nestled between towering pines and overlooking a small icy creek, was a place of quiet reflection, filled with the scent of sawdust and the faint echoes of memories he wasn't quite ready to let go of. Jack's days were marked by routine, chopping wood for the stove, carving intricate patterns into reclaimed timber for furniture, and walking the trails that wove through the forest like veins. It was during one such walk, late in the afternoon, that a low, guttural sound pierced the stillness. Jack froze mid-step, the axe slung over his shoulder momentarily forgotten. The growl carried a note of pain, reverberating through the trees. He scanned the area, squinting against the gray light filtering through the bare branches. The sound came again, a raw mix of a growl and a whimper. Jack's heart thudded. He knew what it was. He'd spent enough time in these woods to recognize the cry of a bear. Caution tempered his curiosity as he tightened his grip on the axe handle, moving carefully. Jack followed the sound, his boots leaving deliberate imprints in the snow. The forest, once tranquil, seemed to pulse with tension, the distant caws of crows providing an eerie soundtrack to his search. It wasn't long before he came upon the source, a large black bear lying partially obscured by brush, her massive frame rising and falling in uneven breaths. Her dark eyes locked onto him with a mixture of defiance and desperation. Jack's gaze dropped to her front leg, and his stomach clenched. The bear's paw was clamped in the jagged metal teeth of a steel trap, blood seeping into the snow beneath her. She snarled weakly as he approached, her muscles trembling with pain and exhaustion. For a moment, every survival instinct Jack had screamed at him to turn back, yet something about the bear's vulnerability kept him rooted in place. He'd seen injured animals before, elk with broken antlers, foxes limping through frost, but this was different. There was an intelligence in her eyes, a flicker of understanding that tempered the wild fury he expected. Jack spoke softly, his voice calm despite the knot forming in his chest. "I'm not here to hurt you, girl. Let's figure this out together." The bear growled again but didn't move to lunge, her strength clearly sapped. Jack took a tentative step closer, keeping his movements deliberate and his voice low. From his satchel, Jack pulled out the small loaf of bread he'd baked that morning. He tore off a piece, tossing it gently toward the bear. She sniffed the offering, her nostrils flaring as hunger momentarily overrode her pain. Jack tossed another piece, then knelt a few feet away, assessing the trap. It was old, rusted, and cruelly efficient, its jagged edges biting deep into her flesh. He swallowed hard, wiping his palms on his coat before gripping a sturdy stick. Using the stick as a lever, he wedged it beneath the trap's release mechanism, his hands trembling as he applied pressure. The trap resisted, groaning under the strain, and Jack's breath came in sharp bursts, visible in the icy air. Finally, with a metallic snap, the trap's jaws released their grip. The bear withdrew her injured paw with a sharp intake of breath, retreating a few steps but not running. Jack stayed crouched, his body taut, waiting for her next move. She stared at him, her dark eyes still watchful but no longer wild. Blood dripped from her paw onto the snow, and Jack resisted the urge to reach for her, knowing it would break the fragile trust forming between them. After a long moment, the bear turned and limped into the trees, her silhouette disappearing into the twilight. Jack exhaled a shaky breath, sinking onto a nearby log, his limbs trembling with the adrenaline of the encounter. As the forest settled back into its familiar rhythm, Jack rose and made his way home. The walk felt longer than usual, each step weighed down by the memory of the bear's eyes and the unspoken connection they'd shared. Back at his cabin, the fire crackled warmly in the hearth, but the heat did little to soothe Jack's restless mind. He replayed the moment over and over, the trap, the bear's growls, the silent understanding that passed between them. Something about it felt significant, though he couldn't yet articulate why. That night, as the wind howled softly against the cabin's wooden walls, Jack lay awake, the bear's eyes lingering in his thoughts like a quiet plea for compassion he hadn't realized he was capable of answering. The days after Jack Harper's encounter with the bear passed in a strange rhythm. The quiet of his cabin, once a comfort, now seemed charged with an expectant energy he couldn't quite explain. He spent his mornings as usual, chopping wood, tending to his small vegetable garden, and working on a rocking chair he had promised to a neighbor last spring, but his thoughts frequently strayed to the forest, to the bear he had freed, and to the way her eyes had seemed to linger on him before she disappeared into the trees. He told himself it was unlikely he would ever see her again, but the memory of her dark, watchful gaze remained vivid, refusing to fade into the ordinary haze of passing days. It was during one of these mornings, as Jack worked on the rocking chair in his workshop, that he heard it, a deep, guttural sound carried faintly on the crisp winter air. He paused, his chisel hovering above the smooth curve of wood, straining to listen. The sound came again, low and resonant, unmistakably a bear's growl. Jack set down his tools, wiping his hands on his flannel shirt as he stepped outside. The sunlight was pale, filtering weakly through the skeletal branches of the pines, and a chill breeze swept through the clearing. Jack scanned the tree line, his pulse quickening when he spotted movement. Emerging cautiously from the shadows was the black bear, her powerful frame limping slightly as she approached. But this time, she wasn't alone. Two smaller shapes flanked her, their movements hesitant and curious, cubs. Jack blinked, stunned. They were smaller than he would have expected, their fur thick and scruffy. One was nearly jet black, while the other had a faint brownish tint around its ears and paws. The mother bear paused at the edge of the clearing, her injured paw raised slightly off the ground, her cubs pressing close to her sides. Jack's heart thudded as he took a step forward, his breath misting in the air. The bear growled softly, not a warning but a sound that seemed more like a statement. She lowered her head, and to Jack's utter disbelief, she dropped something onto the ground. It gleamed faintly in the sunlight, a fish, freshly caught and still glistening with water. Jack let out a soft, incredulous laugh, his voice unsteady. "You've got to be kidding me," he whispered. The bear watched him, her massive head tilting slightly as though gauging his reaction. Her cubs shifted nervously, their small bodies tensing with each twitch of her ears. Jack approached slowly, his boots crunching in the snow, and stopped a few feet away from the fish. He crouched, his movements deliberate, his voice low. "You brought this for me?" He didn't expect an answer, of course, but the question felt natural. The bear didn't move, her dark eyes steady on his. Jack picked up the fish, its cold, slippery texture grounding him in the surreal moment. He held it up slightly in a gesture of gratitude, then stepped back to allow the bear her space. The cubs, emboldened by his retreat, began to sniff around the clearing, their stubby legs awkwardly navigating the uneven snow. One cub stumbled over a small log, letting out a surprised yelp before scrambling to its feet. Jack chuckled, the sound warm and unbidden, and to his amazement, the mother bear seemed to relax slightly. She let out a low huff, nudging the clumsier cub gently with her nose before turning her gaze back to Jack. He stood still, unsure of what to do next, until the bear took a slow step backward, then another, her cubs following her lead. Jack watched as they disappeared into the forest, their shapes melting into the shadows as seamlessly as they had appeared. For a long moment, Jack stood there, the fish still in his hands, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. He knew animals exhibited intelligence, he had watched ravens solve puzzles and deer navigate obstacles, but this was something else entirely. The bear had remembered him, sought him out, and offered a gesture of gratitude that felt almost human. It was humbling and unsettling in equal measure, a reminder of how little he truly understood about the creatures he shared this wilderness with. That evening, Jack prepared the fish for dinner, feeling a twinge of guilt as he cooked it over the wood stove. He wasn't sure if it was because the fish felt like a gift too sacred to consume or because it served as a tangible reminder of the connection he had forged with the bear. Either way, the meal tasted different, richer somehow, as though the forest itself had offered him a share of its bounty. After eating, Jack sat by the fire, his thoughts drifting back to the clearing and the cubs' tentative exploration. He felt a strange pang of longing, a desire to see them again, to understand more about their lives and the bond they shared with their mother. It was foolish, perhaps, to grow attached to wild animals, but the thought refused to leave him. Over the next few days, Jack found himself looking out toward the tree line more often, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. He began leaving small offerings at the edge of the clearing, apples, nuts, and occasionally scraps of bread he had baked. He wasn't sure if the bear would return, but something in him needed to make the gesture. It felt like an acknowledgement, a way of saying, "I see you. I respect you." At first, the offerings went untouched, the snow around them undisturbed. But one morning, Jack noticed faint paw prints leading to the pile, and the food was gone. He smiled to himself, a quiet satisfaction settling in his chest. As the days turned into weeks, the visits became more regular. The mother bear, whom Jack began calling Maddie, would sometimes appear at the edge of the clearing, her cubs trailing behind her. They never ventured too close, but Jack didn't mind. He spoke to them softly, his voice carrying across the still air, and watched as the cubs grew bolder, darting a few steps forward before retreating to their mother's side. Maddie, for her part, seemed to tolerate his presence, her massive frame radiating a calm strength that Jack found both awe-inspiring and oddly reassuring. In those moments, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the forest and the unexpected company of his wild neighbors, Jack felt a sense of connection he hadn't known he needed. The grief that had clung to him since Margaret's passing began to loosen its hold, replaced by a fragile but growing hope. Life, he realized, had a way of surprising you when you least expected it, weaving threads of meaning through even the quietest corners of existence. For the first time in years, Jack found himself looking forward to what the next day might bring, and the thought filled him with a warmth that rivaled even the coziest fire. The wind howled around Jack Harper's cabin, shaking its wooden walls and rattling the windows as the first signs of a fierce storm descended upon the Montana wilderness. The sky, heavy with an ominous gray, pressed down on the treetops as snow fell in relentless sheets, quickly blanketing the forest in a smothering layer of white. Inside, Jack stoked the wood stove, feeding it another log as the flames crackled and threw dancing shadows across the room. He was no stranger to winter storms. They were a part of life out here, their isolation both a challenge and a comfort. But tonight, something felt different, a tension in the air that he couldn't quite place. Perhaps it was his anticipation of seeing Maddie again, her visits now as much a part of his days as his morning coffee. He shook the thought away, pulling a quilt over his legs as he settled into his armchair. The storm intensified as darkness swallowed the cabin. Snow battered the windows with increasing ferocity, and the wind howled like a living thing, its cries echoing through the trees. Jack had just begun to doze when a sudden sound jolted him awake, a frantic scratching at the door, urgent and insistent, cutting through the storm's fury. His heart leapt. For a moment, he thought it might be the wind playing tricks on his ears, but then it came again, more desperate this time. Throwing off the quilt, Jack rose, his pulse quickening as he approached the door. He pulled it open, and the icy wind slammed into him, stinging his face and stealing his breath. Standing in the swirling snow was Maddie, her massive frame coated in frost, her dark fur matted with ice. Her growls were low and guttural, her eyes sharp with urgency as she pawed at the ground and glanced back into the storm. Jack barely had time to process the sight before she growled again, stepping back as if urging him to follow. "What is it, girl?" Jack shouted over the wind. The next few minutes were a blur of movement. The helicopter's back hatch opened, the stretcher was secured inside, and John climbed in after it, gripping the overhead rail as the pilot signaled for takeoff. The ground fell away beneath them, the endless stretch of forest shrinking as they ascended into the open sky. John kept his gaze on the bear, watching the slow, steady rise and fall of its massive chest. It was still breathing. Still here. That was all that mattered. For now, the flight was turbulent, pockets of wind shaking the aircraft as they soared over the landscape, but John barely noticed. His mind was a tangled mess of thoughts running in loops he couldn't seem to break. He had encountered injured animals before, rescued more than he could count, but this was different. This wasn't just a wounded creature in need of aid, there was something else at play, something unspoken in the way the bear had looked at him, the way it had allowed him to help, to touch it, to stand so close without a trace of fear. A wild animal should have seen him as a threat, yet somehow, it hadn't. The helicopter landed smoothly on the rooftop helipad of the Wildlife Center, and within seconds, the team was in motion. John jumped down, following as the stretcher was wheeled through the facility, past sterile white walls and into a large medical bay designed for treating large animals. The head veterinarian, Dr. Elaine Porter, was already waiting, her team prepped and ready. "Vitals," she called as they maneuvered the bear onto the examination table. "Stable but weak," Mark answered, unclipping the straps. "Severe lacerations from multiple traps, significant blood loss, possible infection." John stepped back, watching as Elaine ran practiced hands over the bear's body, checking wounds, assessing damage. The room buzzed with activity, machines beeping, voices exchanging rapid instructions, gloved hands working quickly to clean and dress injuries. John's fingers curled into fists at his sides, frustration simmering beneath the surface. He had done what he could, but it wasn't enough. It never felt like enough. "John." Elaine's voice pulled him from his thoughts. She was looking at him now, her sharp eyes softened by something unreadable. "You did good bringing it in when you did. This bear has a chance because of you." He swallowed hard, nodding once. But a chance wasn't a promise. A chance wasn't a guarantee. And as he stood there, feeling the weight of it all settle in his chest, he realized just how much he wanted this animal to live. Hours passed. John paced the waiting area, his nerves frayed from too much coffee and not enough answers. Mark had left to file his report, and the rest of the rescue team had moved on to their next assignment. But John remained. He couldn't leave, not yet, not until he knew. The clock on the wall ticked endlessly, the rhythmic sound drilling into his skull. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the scuffed linoleum floor as exhaustion crept in. He didn't even realize he had drifted off until a voice shook him awake. "John." His head snapped up, blinking the sleep from his eyes as Elaine stood in front of him. Her face was unreadable, but there was no urgency in her posture, no grief weighing down her expression. That had to be a good sign. "It pulled through the surgery," she said, and John exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "We managed to stop the bleeding and clean out the wounds. The infection was bad, but we're hitting it with everything we've got. It's not out of the woods yet, but..." She offered a small, tired smile. "It's strong." John let out a slow breath, leaning back against the chair as the tension finally loosened in his chest. "Yeah," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "It is." Elaine sat beside him, crossing her arms. "You should go home. Get some rest." He shook his head. "I want to stay. At least until it wakes up." She studied him for a long moment before nodding. "All right. But try not to wear a hole in the floor while you wait." John huffed a quiet laugh, but the moment was short-lived. His thoughts were already drifting back to the bear, to the way it had looked at him, as if recognizing him in a way no wild animal should. He didn't believe in fate. He didn't believe in things happening for a reason. But something about this didn't feel like an accident. And as he sat there, waiting for the bear to wake, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The low hum of medical machines filled the quiet room, their rhythmic beeping marking the steady, unbroken pulse of life. John sat in the corner, arms crossed, eyes locked on the massive form stretched out on the reinforced examination table. The bear's chest rose and fell in deep, slow breaths, the heavy sedation keeping it in a state of deep, healing sleep. The deep gashes along its legs had been stitched with expert precision, thick bandages wrapping the worst of the wounds. An foreline trailed from its foreleg, delivering fluids and antibiotics, a necessary fight against the infection that had already begun creeping through its bloodstream. The air in the room was thick with the scent of antiseptics and fur, the sterile chill of the clinic pressing against John's skin. But he didn't move. He had been here for hours, watching, waiting. Elaine had checked on him once or twice, each time telling him the same thing: he needed rest, needed to eat, needed to step outside for fresh air. But he had ignored every piece of advice she had given. He wasn't leaving. Not yet. Not until he saw it open its eyes. He shifted slightly in his chair, rubbing his hands together for warmth, exhaustion weighing heavy in his bones. His body was tired, but his mind wouldn't settle. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the bear trapped in the snow, its eyes dull with suffering, the steel biting deep into its flesh. He saw the slow, pained trust in the way it had let him near, the way it hadn't fought him, even when it had every reason to. Something about it wouldn't let him go. A deep, low breath rumbled from the table, breaking through the quiet. John straightened instantly, his pulse jumping as he watched the bear's massive frame shift slightly beneath the thin hospital blanket. The slow, measured rise and fall of its ribs changed, quickening, each breath growing sharper. Its ears twitched. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, its eyelids fluttered open. John didn't move, barely dared to breathe as those dark eyes focused, adjusting to the dim light, blinking away the fog of sedation. It lay still for a moment, disoriented, processing, its instincts lightly screaming that something was wrong. That this wasn't the wilderness. That the air smelled too clean, too unnatural. For Jack, it was something simpler, yet no less miraculous, a bond formed between two living creatures, an unspoken understanding that transcended the boundaries between man and beast. The townsfolk, intrigued by the story of Matty's role in the rescue, began to visit Jack's cabin in small groups. Parents brought their children, young faces alight with curiosity and wonder, while older residents listened intently, their weathered features softening as Jack recounted the bear's quiet heroism. Jack was not used to such attention, having spent most of his life in solitude, but he welcomed it. Sharing the story felt like paying tribute to Matty, a way of ensuring that the depth of her actions was not forgotten. The children, in particular, seemed enthralled, their imaginations captivated by the idea of a bear who saved lives and returned acts of kindness. "Will she come back?" one small boy asked one day, his voice brimming with hope. Jack smiled, his eyes drifting toward the tree line. "If she does, it'll be on her own terms. She's a wild thing, not ours to hold on to. But she'll always be a part of this place." It wasn't long before the story reached beyond the boundaries of their small community. A journalist from the state newspaper arrived at Jack's door one crisp morning, notebook in hand and a camera slung over her shoulder. She listened carefully as Jack spoke, her pen flying across the page as he described Matty's first appearance, the moments of trust that had grown between them, and the blizzard night that had brought them closer than ever. Her article, published a week later, painted a vivid picture of the bond between man and bear, and the story struck a chord with readers. Letters began arriving at Jack's cabin, handwritten notes from strangers who had read about Matty and been moved by her actions. Some shared their own encounters with wildlife, while others simply wrote to thank Jack for reminding them of the connection humans could have with the natural world. Jack read each letter carefully, his hands trembling slightly at the weight of their words. It was humbling to know that his quiet life, so far removed from the noise of the wider world, had resonated with so many people. As winter gave way to spring, the community decided to honor Matty's story in a way that would leave a lasting impact. A group of residents approached Jack with the idea of hosting a festival, one that would celebrate not only Matty's heroism but also the importance of coexistence with wildlife. At first, Jack hesitated. He had never been one for grand gestures or public events, preferring the solitude of his cabin and the steady rhythm of his days. But as he listened to their plans, a gathering that would include educational talks, art displays, and fundraising efforts for local conservation initiatives, he found himself nodding. "If it helps people understand how important it is to respect and protect what's out there," he said, "then it's worth doing." The first annual Mountain Spirit Festival was held in late summer, its name chosen to reflect the awe-inspiring presence of Matty in the wilderness she called home. The festival was a modest affair by design, held in the town square under strings of lights and colorful banners. Jack was surprised by how many people attended, some traveling from neighboring states to take part. There were stalls selling handmade goods, a small stage for speakers, and a photo exhibit featuring snapshots of Montana's breathtaking landscapes and its diverse wildlife. Jack himself was asked to speak, and though public speaking was far from his comfort zone, he agreed. Standing on the stage, the afternoon sun warm on his face, he gazed out at the crowd and took a deep breath. "When I first saw Mattie," he began, "she was in pain, caught in a trap meant to harm her. I could have walked away, but something stopped me. I think it was her eyes that didn't just see me as a man, but as a part of this world, like she is. What she did that night, leading me to those children, wasn't just an act of instinct. It was an act of connection, a reminder that we're not so different from the creatures we share this land with. We both want to survive, to protect what we love. And if we can remember that, maybe we can learn to live side by side." The applause that followed was overwhelming, but what stayed with Jack most were the conversations he had afterward. Parents approached him with their children, thanking him for inspiring them to teach the next generation about conservation. A young artist presented him with a painting of Mattie and her cubs, their forms rendered in sweeping, vibrant strokes that seemed alive. Jack accepted it with a quiet smile, his heart full in a way it hadn't been in years. As the seasons turned, Mattie's visits became less frequent. Jack assumed her cubs had grown and moved on, venturing into new territories as they began their own lives. Yet he never stopped watching the tree line, hoping for a glimpse of her unmistakable silhouette. On quiet evenings, as the sun set behind the mountains and bathed the cabin in golden light, Jack would sit on his porch, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, and think of her. She had changed his life in ways he could never have imagined, filling the space left by grief with something profound and enduring. When Jack passed away many years later, the community came together to create a lasting tribute, a grove of aspens planted near his cabin, named Harper's Refuge. It became a sanctuary for both people and wildlife, a place where visitors could reflect on the power of kindness and the fragile beauty of the natural world. And though Mattie's footprints had long since faded from the snow, her spirit remained in every rustle of leaves and every whisper of wind, a testament to the bond she had shared with the man who saw her not as a threat, but as a kindred soul.